of vaccination. I mean, we go back to Edward Jenner and his vaccination for smallpox in the 1770s and earlier. Actually, it turns out that vaccines have been around certainly since the 10th century. There's evidence that the Chinese were vaccinating against smallpox using a very similar method to the methods of Jenner inoculating with cowpox. And so we're in an era of vaccines. We still don't really have a good sense of exactly how all these things work. We understand pasteurization because that was introduced by Louis Pasteur in the late 19th century, about 1880s, somewhere like that. But we still don't have any clue about about viruses. Now, the word virus had been out there for centuries. The word virus meant a poison. So you could talk about something as a virus, meaning it was some kind of poison. But the idea of viruses as these very tiny creatures, about a 20th the size of a bacterium, that cause disease, that was simply not known until really the 1930s. And we are still in an era, as I talk about in the book, where enemas, bloodletting, and whiskey are are treatments for influenza. So things were better, but not a whole lot better.
We don't know where Spanish flu begins, if I have it correct, but what are some theories on that?
Well, first of all, let's remind everybody where it didn't begin. So Spanish flu did not begin in Spain. The reason that we hear about the word Spanish flu is this. During the Great War, during World War I, there was a tacit agreement between the governments of the Allies, including the US, including Great Britain and others, not to talk about the epidemic of influenza unnecessarily, not to cover it in great detail. And now certainly there are historic records, and I've looked at many newspapers from the time in which influenza appears on the front page of the newspaper. But there are many more examples in which the whole topic of epidemic influenza is really either not discussed at all or put in the very back page. And the reason that we get this term, the Spanish influenza, is just to remind everybody, Spain was neutral in the First World War. And so its press was relatively more free to discuss things, including the outbreak of influenza in Europe, than were newspapers elsewhere. And so the first reports that we have of influenza in early 1918, spring of 1918, these actually come from Spanish newspapers, which meant now that when these were reported secondarily, people referred to it as Spanish influenza, when in fact all they were saying was the influenza that was reported by newspapers in Spain. So what we have going back then is this idea that the Spanish influenza certainly didn't come from Spain, but was first reported there. So where did it come from? There are three main theories. The first theory is that it was cooked here in the good old US of A. And the suggestion here is that it came from a place called Haskell County in Kansas. There in Haskell County, Haskell County is a large county, some 1,700 square miles in rural Kansas, and a physician there noted that on one day in January or February time of 1918, there were 18 cases of influenza and 3 deaths. And he, several months later, reported this. But the suggestion is that Haskell County might have been the epicenter of the epidemic. And it kind of makes sense because, as I said, it's a farming community, lots of animals, and we know that animals play an important part in the transmission of influenza from the birds who originally had the virus to humans through an intermediate animal, probably a horse or a cow, probably a horse or a pig. So the first theory is that it was in Haskell County, and from there it spread out into local army bases, camps, and from there through the rest of certainly the United States and Europe. That's one theory. There are two other theories. The second theory is that it actually probably first occurred somewhere in the army camps in France in 1916. The suggestion there is that, again, there was close mingling between troops and animals, pigs, and allowed the virus to travel from birds into pigs and then into us. And the support for that is really this, that when the virus actually broke out worldwide in 1918, it was all over the world very quickly in an era where there was no international travel. So how did it get there? How did it get to places like China and Senegal and India and the United States so quickly? The answer, according to some people, is that it was actually there in 1916 during a sort of a smaller epidemic, and it sort of seeded across the rest of the world to flare up at all different places in 1918. So that's the second theory, northern France. And briefly, the third theory is that it came actually from China. We know that probably 140,000 Chinese workers were brought to serve in a support role on the battlefields of Europe. And early in 1918, there were reports of an influenza type disease spreading from China. So the third theory is that it came from China. So these are the three theories. There is support for each of them. There are problems with each of them. We'll never know for sure.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I've hired a number of people to help out with this show in audio editing, online content creation, but it is really hard to hire someone because there are millions of people who post their skills online, and how do you tell someone actually knows what they're doing versus someone who knows how to fake a resume? How do you find good applicants with the right education experience? How do you know you've made the right hire? That's where Indeed is here to help. Millions of candidates use Indeed every day to find their next opportunity, but most importantly, Indeed filters them. You can post a job in minutes, and you can use screener questions to help create your short list of applicants really fast. You can also add skills tests to your job post, so you know that your applicants actually have the abilities they say they do. They have a library of more than 50 skills, and the tests range from industry-specific skills like accounting to general aptitude tests like critical thinking. Indeed will give you what you need to make hiring decisions quickly and know that you've made the right hire for your team. Post your job today at Indeed.com/unplugged and get a free sponsorship job upgrade for your first posting. That's Indeed.com/unplugged. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. This offer is valid through March 31st, 2020. What I'm curious about is, why did this happen in 1918 and not some other time? Because influenza isn't new. It goes back to the beginning and maybe even predates humanity. Don't really know how influenza works with simians, but was it because you had this primitive type of globalization with steamships and railroads in a way that connects a world it wouldn't have in the early 1800s, but you don't have the way to prevent it? Or is it something else? Like, why is it 1918 where this happens?
Well, if you can answer that question, you can answer the key question that the really epidemiologists have been grappling with ever since, which is, could this happen again? In other words, if we know exactly why 1918 and not 1917 or 1919, then can we know the factors and can we prevent it from happening again? So first of all, there have been epidemic influenzas for centuries. They, depending on how you define the word an epidemic and exactly how you define the flare-up, they can be anywhere from every 20 to every 50 years. There was a particularly bad influenza epidemic, for instance, in the 1889 that affected both Great Britain and the United States, with many, many deaths, sort of a minor flare-up. Since 1918, we've had outbreaks of influenza across the world. In 1957, in Hong Kong, we had an epidemic of and we should say a near epidemic of swine flu in 1976. It was actually the threat of an epidemic, but it never materialized. We, of course, had swine flu in 2009. So there have been many, many epidemics of influenza. Why this one was particularly bad is really still a challenge to say. Certainly the overcrowding of the troops as they went back and forth from Europe into, from the battlefields of Europe back into the United States, back into Great Britain and other places, played a role. There was also a great deal of overcrowding in tenement buildings. As you can imagine, a big influx of refugees from Eastern Europe, perhaps. It's really difficult to say exactly what was the critical factor that made it flare up in 1918. Perhaps it was sort of all of the above. We'll never know for sure.
You mentioned at the beginning that there was a gentleman's agreement on the part of the Allies and the Central Powers not to discuss it. And I'm guessing they simply wanted it to go away because they had their hands full with the war. How did other authorities treat Spanish influenza? Did they ignore it, hoping that it would go away in a similar manner? What was it like from their perspective?
Well, from the perspective of the healthcare workers, I think there was no ignoring it. And it became a public health problem very quickly. So, for instance, in December of 1918, in the midst of the pandemic, which just to sort of remind people that it sort of flared up in early spring of 1918, then seemed to go away in late spring, only to rear up again in a much more seemingly aggressive way in the fall of 1918 through early 1919. Anyway, in the midst of that epidemic in December, 1,000 public health officials gather in Chicago to sort of put their brains together and think, discuss what they can do. And rather than ignore it, they just fully admitted that they had no idea what this was. One doctor stood up and said, we should call this the X germ because we have no idea what it was from. There was another physician suggested that the only way to reduce the spread was to put each diseased person in a diver's suit. I'm sure there was some chuckles or in the conference hall whether they meant this really or just tongue in cheek is difficult to say. And then actually what struck me was a statement from the health commissioner from Chicago who said, look, I don't know what's causing this. I don't want people to worry. So let people do whatever it takes for them to stop worrying. And he was actually referencing the wearing of masks, which were very much in fashion in 1918. And I'm sure many people have seen those pictures of police officers walking around in these rather flimsy cloth or paper masks. But he was basically saying if people want to wear masks and it gives them a sense of security, that's fine. He also said from their part, let them wear a rabbit's foot on a gold watch chain if they want, as long as it will keep them happy. So they really were sort of very hands-on, as it were, trying to get this under control. Of course, the public health officials at the time were putting out notices, these famous big notices saying no spitting and please wear your masks. And there were also efforts to close down movie theaters and cafes and so on that we can talk about. School districts were closed across the United States, although interestingly, Chicago and New York, two of the biggest school districts at the time, actually kept their schools open. Other school districts, San Francisco, Baltimore, Boston, decided to close down. So it's, there are very great similarities to today where we're already hearing that some local area, county and state and officials are taking certain precautions that other state officials in other areas might think, well, we don't quite have to do that yet. So a lot of similarity there.
I want to get into the protocol they used and what was useful and then what was the opposite and actually caused more harm. But for somebody on the ground in 1918, was there a slow burn? Did they start to realize that something was going down and then a feeling of panic broke out? Or was it just part of the difficulties of living during the Great War when if this didn't kill you, then something else could get you?
Well, it's interesting that, I put together the story from newspapers, and one of the things that I found that really goes to this was a sort of being stoic about it. I found a report actually from the Times of London in December of 1918, and it said, and this was as the pandemic is ending, so the Times of London writes, never since the Black Death has such a plague swept over the face of the world, never perhaps has a plague been more stoically accepted. I don't know if people were really stoically accepting this thing or not. In fact, earlier this year, the medical correspondent for the Times of London writes with clearly must have been a huge exaggeration. He describes the people who were, quote, cheerfully anticipating the arrival of the epidemic. Now, nobody cheerfully anticipates the arrival of any epidemic. But I think you get a sense, certainly from these at least this British correspondent, of some amount of stoicism. I think, again, we were living in such a different era. Life expectancy was probably 20 or 30 years less than it is today. You could die of scarlet fever, which is a complication of strep throat, just as easily as you could die from an infection if you fell off a tree. You were a kid and you fell off a tree, broke your arm, cut your arm, got infected. We were living in the pre-antibiotic era. So surely it was a very, very different time where mortality must have been just much more part and parcel of everybody's daily lives. But of course, that's not to say that it wasn't there wasn't a great deal of fear as this influenza took hold. And I think, for me, reading these reports, for me, the most troubling and perhaps the scariest part of this whole thing was the fact that there were these people who did not know what it was that was causing the infection, what it was that was killing them, because they had no idea. They thought any